So I would like to invite Benjamin Bratton. Very glad you're here. Fantastic. I'm not sure if he needs an introduction, but to be sure, a writer whose work spans philosophy, computer science, geopolitics, professor of philosophy of technology and speculative design at the University of California in San Diego, director of I actually don't know how to pronounce this. I've never heard this pronounced, but Antikythera. This is actually a city in ancient Greek and a location where ancient Greece, a location where a particular artifact was dug up, and this serves as an example of the earliest, basically, machine that does computing, if I'm correct. But Antikythera right now is a think tank on the speculative philosophy of computation at the Berggruen Institute, which will also launch its event tomorrow. I think you'll refer to it a little bit. Yeah. Also professor of digital design at the European Graduate School and visiting professor at the SciArc and at the NYU Shanghai. I'll give the floor to you right now. Thank you, Mark.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Klaus and Arthur and Leonardo and Renee and Nieuwe and everyone for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out this evening to join us in the celebration of the publication of the Big Yellow Book, the new Yellow Pages. We'll refer to, I'm sure, for some time. So, for my title here as well, the remarks I prepared for you are on the topic of planetary computation, and particularly the kinds of, let's say, multipolarity that the verticalatlas maps, and just try to just ask some questions and try to perhaps be a little bit more specific of what that means. What is it? What is this condition that we're describing? One that is, as my subtitle suggests, full of both potential and peril, and I hope to do a bit of justice to both of those, that is, to the potential and the peril. I should also say, I mean, I'm extraordinarily grateful that a book that I wrote some time ago would help inspire a project like this in whatever small way. As I fondly recall, some of the initial conversations around the project, after I had presented an early version of an essay called Hemispherical Stacks, which is included in the book, at the HKW in Berlin in 2017, and then again here at HNI in 2018. And I mean, since then, the project has grown and departed decisively and creatively. Oh, I'm sorry, am I going in and out? Yeah, it's part of the. This is how it should be. Oh, really? I'm going to do a slide with the error message on it next time. Just say all the IT people come running and panicking up here as well. A video of it glitching, the whole deal. Yeah. I'm ready. Okay. So anyway, so I'm going to go back. This is on purpose, because I have my notes here. I'm sorry. So anyway, I'll just go ahead. I don't want to freak anyone out. Now, okay, so as Klaus and Leonardo and we were talking a bit earlier, but also as Arthur sort of suggested, here we are looking towards the 22nd century. It becomes clear that the geopolitics to come and the planetary computational infrastructures with which they operate are not two separate things. They are different names that we use for deeply woven socio-technical processes operating at continental scale. Now, even a decade ago, or half a decade ago when the book was published, such a statement would probably seem closer to science fiction than to political science. But now even the relatively conservative disciplines of law and international relations accept, perhaps grudgingly, that planetary computation is more than a domain over which normal sovereignty rules. It is something from which sovereignty itself is derived. It comes to constitute a form of sovereignty in and of itself, both for good and ill. So towards that, these days, I find myself explaining the stack thesis to increasingly mainstream forums, much more so than when the book came out. And that is somehow the premise of the book, which was then speculative, is now more something closer to common sense. but that does not have only positive valences. So what I want to do in my time here is to sort of offer some bridges between that situation and the more specific point, again, of like what has been atlased in the book. First, what is the planetarity of planetary scale computation? Foremost, it is the recognition that computation is not simply an abstract mathematical process or a property of particular appliances, but rather an infrastructural dynamic with geosocial, geological, geochemical, and geopolitical implications. It's not to be confused as well with the hypervisible dominance of social media, for example. Most of planetary computation you can't see, and it's neither about you or for you. That said, the image of the social that it reflects is distorted and even bizarre. As I have argued elsewhere, it is in the incessant individuation of planetary computation and the operative presumption that its primary purpose is to model the behavior of individual persons and to amplify the desires of individual users is a fundamental pathology that cannot be remedied simply by intensifying atomization and anonymization, even in the name of privacy and personal data. Additionally, planetary computation is not synonymous with Silicon Valley, neither the real place nor with real workers, nor the metonymic dystopia conjured by European critique. Its future will be drawn in the China-Africa nexus as much, if not more, than in the San Francisco-Berlin symbiosis. All of that being said, we are here to launch a particular kind of atlas, a particular book. So what is this book? And after Stafford Beer's axiom of the purpose of a system is what it does, what does Vertical Atlas do? Well, verticality reveals things that horizontality cannot. The mapping of geologic sedimentary layers, for example, was essential to the discovery of deep time and to all of its existential implications. The stack, too, was a kind of diagram for a future atlas, a vertical atlas, of which the Yellow Book is one good possible example. Traditionally, however, the atlas has been a complication of the Mercator projection and all of its flattening distortions. These horizontal atlases posed and came with many risks. The map came to determine the territory in ways that were less than ideal, such as nationalism. In the extreme, horizontalism can engender relentless performative cultural determinism. Horizontal orthodoxy risks becoming a kind of fundamentalism. Verticality maps a different kind of planetary geosociality that cannot be explained with horizontalist perspectives. I mean this both in the sense of horizontalist politics, perhaps on the left, and the horizontalist perspective of politics as in the Mercator projection. The vertical is already transnational in the lines that it draws. It is one that potentially challenges both left and right versions of cultural determinism. The horizontalism that I describe, particularly from the reactionary right, takes the form of, as I say, a new kind of cultural determinism and indeed perennialism. We witness an atavistic return to old-school revanchist geopolitics of land and place and soil, complete with mytho-nationalist appeals to the romantic primacy of pure cultures, lost empires, and original maps. In a recent article in The Economist that references the stack extensively in its presentation of Russia's attempt to build its own version of a sovereign internet, a phrase with slippery and contradictory connotations, and it even refers to the Russian stack. I winced when I read this, not just because of the bitter timing of the publication, but also because of how it presented this reality as something new and peculiar. It is neither. The compatibility between the traditional and the technological might seem paradoxical at first blush, but it shouldn't. Their conjunction is an expression of horizontalism, both in politics and in political geography. So, in its appreciation of the diversity of internet cultures, or its attempted appreciation, that article in The Economist also conflated questions of national and regional self-reliance, as in hardware sourcing, with the regionally tuned forms of information culture. In fact, however, the physical machine and the phenomenology of machines can be mutually deterministic or mutually independent in various ratios. And we see this explicitly in the verticalatlas. We see different technologies producing different cultures, different technologies embedded with different cultures, the same technology, different cultures, different technology, same culture, all different kinds of potentials at work. So, more specifically then, regarding the multipolarity of planetary computation, both technological multipolarity and cultural multipolarity, I want to emphasize this word potential because in many ways, the model of multipolarity that the humanities more generally proposes for the multipolar quickly devolves sometimes into a kind of superficial multiculturalism plus anti-realist relativism, which is a dangerous place to end up. Let me explain. So while I strongly agree emphatically that modes of futurity and the planetarity of planetary computation must be composed in ways that go beyond Western and European traditions, we might want to ask, what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to go beyond a European tradition or perspective? It should not need to be said, but let me say it anyway, especially to my friends in art and design worlds, present company excluded, of course, but that going beyond the European toward a viable planetarity does not mean a romantic embrace of all the things that Europe believes it is not, but that others are. Not all the things that Europe believes it is not, but others are. That is, traditional, intuitive, magical, embodied, poetic, small, simple, immediate, ineffable, immeasurable, uncomputable, familial, non-scientific, non-technological, spiritual, associative, being-aligned, harmonious, ahistorical, inert. That is not going beyond the European. To the contrary, it should be obvious that this tiresome tendency is a dangerous refortification of colonial premises about who and who does not have reason. And yet, strains of this animate and even dominate so many syllabi and symposia and curatorial statements and special issues. The syntax of this tendency is practically built into international art English. This inverted binary fetishization is not an innovative alternative to colonial modernity. It is and has been from the beginning a melancholic passenger on all of its flights. Put differently, it's clear that Europe prefers to be decentered only if it is the center of the decentering. And when its self-image as the protagonist of history is maintained, even if this now takes on negative connotations. So then, for the planetarity of planetary computation, we see mapped in the verticalatlas book, what then is the relation between the universal and the particular that we see here? To my way of saying, what you see in the book is only superficially cultural difference and diversity. It is this, but deeper than that, more fundamentally, what you're seeing is the complexity of a larger condition that is expressed differently in different locations by different people for different reasons. Despite what some may tell you, what you see in verticalatlas is that technical rationality is common across different cultures. It links them together. This is opposed to the more gratuitous notion that technical rationality has been imposed on cultures that did not possess it already. So to affirm the different expressions that I described, this is not remotely the same thing, the differences that are described in this book, this is not remotely the same thing as concluding that there are no technological conditions continuous among Homo sapiens cultures, or that technology itself cannot constitute something like an anthropological universal, because clearly it can. If one were to demand that because phenomenologies of technology are diverse and irreconcilable, and therefore no anthropological or scientific or philosophical universals in and of technology would be possible, would immediately risk the legitimate accusation of a radical idealism that has been made against phenomenology for over a century. That is, to put it directly, unless quite lost, I assume no one wishes to defend a notion that the irreducibly different and perspectival belief systems of a given culture happen to correspond to irreducibly different physical realities in which those cultures exist. What an absolutely anti-universalist phenomenology would require is exactly this, such that a culture that believes the Earth is 1,000 years old would actually be living on an Earth that is 1,000 years old. Now, such a belief may be a social fact with real consequences, but this is not identical with an understanding that the Earth is 4.7 billion years old. And the difference between these two dates has nothing to do with Europe. The difference precedes, transcends, and will long surpass the very idea of Europe or of the West. If so, then the project of a planetary philosophy of technology must grant that the question of the universal and the particular extends to the generality of the planetary, geological, chemical, biological, the animalian forms in which the particularities of hominin migration, primate sapience, complex symbolic cultures, machine intelligence, all the stack cultures that appear in the verticalatlas book are all recent, particular, beautiful, complex expressions and phenomena. If so, then, the book is an atlas, to go back to my first question, of complex intelligence organizing itself in different but continuous and comparable ways. What we see in the book are adaptations to artificial conditions of adaptation. Now, that conclusion, I understand, may diverge somewhat from some colleagues, but in the sense that I place considerable weight on the notion that cultural cosmology emerges from the possibility of thought, and that the possibility of thought emerges from the material realities that are, in the long run, continuous among humans, and even exceed the uncertain boundaries of the human itself. I have a deep interest and appreciation in semiotics, but as an expression of biology and physics, not the other way around. It's certain that specific ecological contexts in which language and symbolic systems emerge produce and constrain the horizons of their semantics, of those semiotics: forest, sea, desert, mountain, jungle, plain, megacity. And so all constitute different, somewhat different niches, demanding somewhat different means of signification. And as we see in the Yellow Book, particular cosmologies also express different natural and artificial ecosystems, and thus would demand a different corresponding phenomenologies of technology. This prepares us, I think, for the really important question and practical question of the moment, which is, beyond what is described as already existing, what are the stacks that should be composed now? What are the stacks to come? What is planetary computation actually for? What planetarity must it provide to us? With regard to the precarity of the present moment, these are questions that must be asked in full light of the fact that the discovery of climate change itself, the very idea of climate change, is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. Without the cumulative, discontiguous megastructure of satellites and sensors and data centers and supercomputer simulations and all the rest, the scientific reality and granularity of the situation would be impossible to intuit. From the discovery of climate change comes the revelation of the Anthropocene, or your preferred prefix, as well as the realization of the geochemical realities of the planet, that these both precede human history and that it is from them that human history emerges, even especially as human history comes to possess an agency to artificially transform that underlying geochemistries and thus its own future. So, beyond what it does, what has planetary computation disclosed? Not only the calculus of climate change, but indirectly the unexpected recognition, as said, of anthropogenic agency, and at planetary scale, a terraforming agency. And through this, an ongoing demystification of planetarity as such, as distinct from the global. So what is different this time? This contemporary episode, the one which we are living through, twisting and a double helix around each other, binding of cultural and technological evolution. Planetarity emerges as a cosmological context, and planetary computation as an epistemic technology. It is different from other geographically defined episodes in human cultural technical history, insofar that what it has disclosed is not just a regional niche, but the planetary geochemical and geosymbolic interrelations that constitute the precondition of human history at all. Post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, I think, makes a corollary argument in his demand that we take history not simply as the internal story of human drama, but to be equally attentive to the biological history that makes human social history possible, and in turn to the geological history that makes biological history possible. Instead of modeling the past, present, and future as conflicts independent of their planetarity, powered by internal engines of economic, eschatological, messianic, dramaturgical direction, one should see them as inextricably intertwined with their preconditions. One would grasp the Anthropocene not simply as the sudden interruption of geochemistry into culture, as a new figural demand on thought, but rather as the eventual interruption of geochemistry by culture, and the ecological, mineral, and chemical agency of symbolic thought and action as such. For this, then, the image of technoscience implied is not one that supposedly obliterates any idea of the past in the name of some new year zero, but rather, to the contrary, one that discloses the reality of greater than cultural preconditions and thus undermines traditional ethnocentric and ethno-temporal cosmologies. The contribution of a materialist cosmotechnics to a cosmopolitics must, as I see it, be on behalf of the former, not the latter. So, thus when Sheila Jasanoff asks, quote, how will scientists' impersonal knowledge of the climate be synchronized with the mundane rhythms of lived lives and the specificities of human experience, unquote, as if human experience is the sovereign referent to which planetary reality must now bend and bow, we might answer by inverting and correcting the question as, quote, how will the mundane rhythms of lived lives and the specificities of human experience be synchronized with the collective and impersonal knowledge of the climate provided by science? Instead of insisting that difficult abstraction make itself comfortable as the immediate price of admission, how do we better train ourselves to see deep time of a geologic past, for example, in our own intimate activities? So, by way of conclusion, as verticalatlas shows that the present state of planetary computation, it shows that it is not so much a global monoculture, but polyphonic and intricately reticulated. The question of planetary governance that is inevitably projected through planetary computation cannot be based on the reification of regional cultures, but the organization of new forms of sensing and modeling and recursion and composition. Perhaps that complexity is right around the corner. Perhaps it is right in front of us but illegible. Perhaps it's what's right on the other side of the wire but too hard to see. I ask because the bookshelf on computation and culture overflows with exposés on how a dominant monoculture enforces a suffocating model on everyone, and in many ways, dangerous ways, of course it does, particularly in the formulation of the user as an autonomous, self-performing identity subject. But I also wonder how much of this new orthodox formula for critique is another kind of monocultural myopia, a Euro-American conceit. Perhaps its strict coherency derives from how the West has long imagined itself to be the protagonist of history in a positive sense, and yet, as it comes to term with its own particularity, it clings to the protections of this main character syndrome. For that, we are still the central model, even if that is now bad instead of good, and so Western writers compete to radicalize our disavowals. I leave you with a quote. Emmanuel Levinas writes in a beautiful little gem from 1961 called Heidegger, Gagarin, and Us. He writes, quote, technical things are dangerous. They not only threaten a person's identity, they risk blowing up the planet. But the enemies of industrial society are in most cases reactionary, unquote. He goes on to suggest that an ethnocentric sense of place is one of the casualties of cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin's leap into the void. Quote, technology wrenches us out of the Heideggerian world and the superstitions surrounding place. From this point on, an opportunity appears to us to perceive men outside the situation in which they are placed and let the human face shine in all of its nudity, unquote. This is then a welcome invitation to invent and compose an alternative that is genuinely planetary, in spirit and deed, that orients our moral and normative capacities with the astronomic condition from which they emerge, and which would be both convergent, because planetary, and divergent, because human, but which is in all senses viable. If so, then it constitutes a computation, a geography, a territory reformed beyond recognition, one that may in fact already be right in front of us. So those are my remarks. I wanted to also, as was mentioned, let you know that there's a new research program that we are launching with the Berggruen Institute with one project called antikythera.org. That's how you say it, antikythera.org, which is indeed the name of what is sort of the apocalyptic first computer from 200 BC, an astronomical device, a device that not only did calculation, but it was a device with which intelligence oriented itself in relationship to its planetary condition, which is, for us, the best answer to the question of what is computation for. So thank you.